At a family dinner, my sister introduced her new fiancé, and for some reason they all kept staring at me. When he asked what I do for work, my mom cut me off, saying, "Do not embarrass us." Everyone laughed. My sister added, "Maybe lie this time, so you do not sound so pathetic." I just smiled, until their faces went pale. My name is Aaliyah. I am 28. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Today, I am going to tell you how I brought my golden child sister and her arrogant fiancé back to reality. The atmosphere at our Buckhead Steakhouse table was freezing. We were celebrating the engagement of my older sister Jasmine to her white fiancé Preston. I sat quietly sipping water. My parents, DeAndre and Valerie, fell over themselves to impress Preston, desperate to show our family belonged in his elite social circles. Preston leaned back, swirling his wine with absolute superiority. He turned to me, scanning my simple black dress. "So, Aaliyah," he said with a condescending smile. "Jasmine tells me you are still trying to figure things out. What do you do for work these days?" Before I could open my mouth, my mother gave me a sharp glare. "She is between jobs right now," she said quickly, turning back to Preston with artificial sweetness. "Please, Aaliyah, do not embarrass us tonight with your struggling artist stories." Laughter erupted around the table. Jasmine flipped her perfectly styled hair and smirked. "Honestly, Aaliyah, maybe lie this time so you do not sound so pathetic in front of Preston." I did not defend myself. I simply took a slow sip of water and smiled. Growing up, Jasmine was the flawless, golden child, while I was the ultimate disappointment. Preston chuckled. "The business world is not for everyone," he declared. "Take my startup Novatech, for example. We are on the verge of closing a massive $20 million funding round." My father leaned forward, his eyes wide with admiration. $20 million. That is incredible, son. Who is the investor? It is a stealth venture capital firm called Apex Innovations. My broker assured me the deal is basically done. Once the CEO signs off tomorrow, Novatech will dominate the market. My father beamed with pride, raising his glass. "Now that is what I call true excellence." He turned his gaze toward me, the warmth replaced by a familiar scowl. "You should take notes, Aaliyah. This is what real success looks like." "Really?" I asked softly. "Yes, really," my father snapped, glaring at me. "Do you have any idea how much you shamed this family when you dropped out of medical school? Instead, you threw away a medical degree to play with useless computer stuff. Look at you now. You have nothing. You should be begging Preston for a job in his mailroom." My mother nodded. "Your father is right. You have always been a lost cause, Aaliyah. Just stay quiet and let your sister enjoy her moment with a man who actually has a future." I looked at Preston, soaking up their endless praise, completely unaware of the reality of his own company. I knew exactly what Novatech was. I knew his technology was obsolete. I knew his entire business model relied on burning through investor cash to fund his lavish lifestyle. "Are you sure Apex Innovations is going to fund you?" I asked casually. "From what I hear, they are very strict about financial due diligence." Jasmine scoffed loudly. "Oh, please. What do you know about venture capital, Aaliyah? You cannot even afford your own car." Preston gave me a patronizing look. "It is fine, Jasmine. She just does not understand how our high society finance works." "Yes, Aaliyah. I am absolutely completely certain. The CEO is reviewing the final paperwork tonight." Right on cue, Preston's phone rang. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Speaking of my broker," he said, flashing a triumphant grin. "This must be the confirmation call right now. I will put it on speaker so you can all hear the good news." He placed the phone in the center of the table and tapped the speaker button. "Hey, David," Preston said confidently. "Tell me we are ready to pop the champagne." The voice on the other end of the line did not sound celebratory. David sounded like he was hyperventilating. "Preston, we have a massive problem." Preston's smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "Just send over the term sheet." "There is no term sheet." "Preston?" David shouted, his panic echoing through the quiet dining room. Apex Innovations just rejected the pitch. They pulled out completely. The deal is dead, Preston demanded, leaning over the phone. You said this was a sure thing. You said the board loved our product. The board did, David replied, sounding utterly defeated. But the CEO personally intervened 20 minutes ago. She reviewed your metrics and killed the deal on the spot. She said your burn rate is a complete disaster and your revenue projections are entirely fabricated. Preston was shaking now, his arrogant facade completely shattered. Who? He yelled into the phone. Who exactly killed my entire deal? Give me the name of this CEO right now. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The broker let out a long sigh. Her name is Aaliyah Coleman. I dabbed the corner of my mouth and looked directly into Preston's eyes. The silence in the room was absolute. Your burn rate is atrocious, Preston, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. Your pitch is permanently denied. Sabotage, Mom. I didn't invent his financial reports. His company is hemorrhaging cash. Novatech doesn't have a product, they have an expensive marketing brochure. I'm protecting my investors. You will approve that $20 million funding immediately. DeMarcus ordered, his voice taking on that familiar booming authority he used whenever he wanted to crush my dissenting opinions. Preston's family is expecting this deal to close. Do you have any idea how it will look if they find out my own daughter killed the investment? We will not be humiliated in front of the Thorntons. Jasmine, seeing her moment, buried her face in her hands and began to weep loud, dramatic sobs that immediately drew the attention of the waiters hovering near the door. I knew she would do this, Jasmine wailed, leaning heavily against Preston. She has always hated me. Ever since she failed out of her own life, she just wants to drag me down with her. Preston, who had briefly lost his color, seemed to draw strength from my family's unified front against me. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned back, his arrogant smirk returning, though slightly strained. Listen to me very carefully, Aaliyah, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. My family has connections in this city that you cannot even begin to comprehend. We are old money. If you don't authorize this funding by tomorrow morning, I will personally ensure that your little boutique firm is blacklisted from every major financial institution in Atlanta. You will be ruined. I stared at him, marveling at the audacity. Old money doesn't beg for venture capital from a black woman they just called a lost cause, Preston, I replied calmly, picking up my purse. And for the record, my boutique firm manages over $2 billion in assets. You couldn't blacklist me if you bought every bank in Georgia. The pitch remains denied. I stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the floor. I'm leaving, and since none of you seem to have $20 million lying around, I'll handle the dinner bill. I walked toward the front counter, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. My heart was pounding, a chaotic mix of adrenaline and the familiar, exhausting ache of my family's rejection. I handed my black card to the maitre d', authorizing the $3,000 charge for the steaks and wine they had consumed while insulting me. As I signed the receipt, I felt a heavy presence behind me. I turned to see my father, DeMarcus. His usual imposing posture was gone. He looked smaller, his face pale and shining with a cold sweat. He glanced nervously back toward the private dining room, where Valerie was still coddling a weeping Jasmine. Aaliyah, he whispered, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard before. You don't understand. You have to approve that funding. You must. Dad, I can't. It's illegal to fund a failing company just because the CEO is sleeping with my sister. It's fiduciary negligence. He grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. You have to, he repeated, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncharacteristic terror. If Preston doesn't get that $20 million, he can't pay me back. I froze. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. Pay you back for what? DeMarcus swallowed hard, looking around to make sure no one was listening. A bridge loan. Preston said he needed a short-term cash injection to finalize some European patents before your firm released the main funding. He said it was just for 30 days. How much, Dad? I demanded, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. How much did you give him? $2 million, he choked out. My breath caught in my throat. $2 million. My parents were comfortable, but they weren't wealthy enough to have $2 million in liquid cash sitting around. Where did you get $2 million? I asked, though a sickening realization was already forming in my gut. DeMarcus looked down at the marble floor, unable to meet my eyes. I took a second mortgage on the house, the ancestral home, and I emptied the retirement accounts. All of it. Preston promised a 50% return once the Apex deal closed. Your mother and I wanted to show his family that we are serious investors, that we belong at their table. I stared at the man who had constantly belittled my business acumen, who had shamed me for dropping out of medical school to build my own company, now standing before me having committed financial suicide for a white con man just to buy social status. You bet our family's legacy on a guy you barely know, I whispered, disgusted. Before he could answer, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from my mother. I opened it, my eyes scanning the harsh words she had rapidly typed out while comforting Jasmine. The anonymous donor just purchased a $5 million estate in Buckhead as a wedding gift for your sister. You see, this is what true elevation looks like. If you had listened to us and stopped being so bitter, you might have a place in this family's future. I stared at the address included in the text message. It was a sprawling property on West Paces Ferry Road. My blood ran cold. I knew that address intimately. I didn't just know the property. My real estate holding company, a subsidiary of Apex Ventures, owned that exact estate. No anonymous donor had bought it. I looked back at my father, who was still waiting for me to magically fix the disaster he had created. I pocketed my phone, the full scope of Preston's deception finally becoming clear. The bridal shower was held at a private country club in Alpharetta, an agonizing display of forced luxury that I only attended to maintain the fragile illusion of family peace. The room was draped in white silk and overflowing with imported orchids. Waiters navigated through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. Jasmine sat at the center of it all, in a custom ivory gown, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction as she opened gifts that cost more than most people's cars. I stood near the back by the tall, arched windows, observing the spectacle. My parents, DeMarcus and Valerie, were hovering near the entrance, practically sweating with anxiety as they waited for the guest of honor to arrive. That guest was Preston's mother, Caroline. When Caroline finally made her entrance, the entire room seemed to shift on its axis. She was the textbook definition of Southern old money, dressed in a tailored pastel suit, with a string of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone. She carried herself with an effortless, terrifying arrogance. My parents immediately rushed forward to greet her, their posture shrinking, their smiles stretched so wide they looked painful. I watched from across the room, my stomach turning, as I witnessed my father, a man who demanded absolute submission from his own children, bow his head in deference. Caroline accepted their greeting with a tight, close-lipped smile that did not reach her cold eyes. She looked my mother up and down, taking in Valerie's carefully chosen designer dress, a dress I knew my mother had spent 2 months' salary on just to fit in today. "It is so cute how your people try to dress up for these things," Caroline said. Her voice was loud enough to carry over the string quartet playing in the corner. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a calculated, racist microaggression delivered with a sugar-coated Southern drawl. I felt my hands ball into fists. I waited for my father to speak up to defend his wife, to show a fraction of the pride he so aggressively lorded over me. Instead, DeMarcus just chuckled nervously. Valerie actually smoothed her dress and thanked Caroline, swallowing her dignity whole just to keep the peace. They were so blinded by their desperation for high society validation that they were willing to let this woman wipe her designer shoes on their self-respect. Satisfied with my parents' submission, Caroline turned her gaze across the room and locked eyes with me. She whispered something to Jasmine, who nodded eagerly, and then Caroline began walking purposefully in my direction. The wealthy guests parted for her like the Red Sea. "Aaliyah, is it?" Caroline asked as she approached, looking at me as if I were a stain on the club's pristine carpet. "Jasmine has told me so much about you. Though looking at you, I must say I am surprised." "Oh," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Surprised by what exactly? Caroline reached out and gestured vaguely toward my head. "Well, the hair, for starters. I suppose natural styles are very trendy right now in certain neighborhoods, but for a country club shower, one would think you would want to look a bit more polished. But then again, Preston mentioned you have a little computer business. I suppose standards are lower when you work from home. A few of Caroline's wealthy friends who had gathered nearby let out soft, condescending laughs. My mother materialized beside me, her eyes wide with panic. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Aaliyah works very hard, Valerie stammered, trying to appease Caroline. She just has a different path than Jasmine. I gently but firmly removed my mother's hand from my arm. I did not break eye contact with Caroline. My little computer business is a venture capital firm managing $2.4 billion in assets, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the quiet chatter of the room. We specialize in fintech acquisitions and corporate restructuring. Caroline let out a patronizing sigh, waving her manicured hand. Numbers on a screen, dear. Flash in the pan tech money. In our circles, we understand that true wealth is generational. It is built on land legacy and trust funds. It is not something you can just conjure up with a lucky startup. You see, the Thorntons have a financial foundation that is bulletproof. I smiled. It was the same dead, emotionless smile I gave right before I dismantled a hostile takeover. A bulletproof foundation, I repeated slowly, letting the words echo. That is fascinating, Caroline. Because my firm's investigative division ran a standard background check on Novatech's principal investors last week, which of course includes the Thornton Family Trust. Caroline's smug expression faltered. Her posture stiffened. Would you like to know what my flash-in-the-pan tech money uncovered? I asked, taking a step closer to her. I uncovered that your husband filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the District of Delaware exactly 14 days ago. The color vanished from Caroline's face. The women standing around her gasped softly, exchanging shocked glances. I did not stop. I let the financial data roll off my tongue with ruthless precision. I uncovered that the Thornton Generational Trust was quietly liquidated last year to cover over $12 million in defaulted commercial real estate loans. I uncovered that your estate in Charleston currently has a mechanic's lien on it, and the luxury cars you leased for Preston's startup were repossessed on Tuesday. You do not have generational wealth, Caroline. You have a mountain of debt, a desperate son, and a heavily mortgaged facade. Caroline's face turned a violent shade of red. Her chest heaved as she struggled to find her breath. She whipped around to face my mother, her mask of Southern charm completely gone, replaced by pure venomous rage. Caroline shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. You control your daughter this instant. You put her in her place right now, or this wedding is absolutely over. My mother looked like she was going to faint. She looked frantically between me and Caroline, her hands trembling. Aaliyah, apologized to her right now. Valerie begged, her voice cracking with hysteria. Please, you are ruining everything. I am not apologizing for reading public financial records, I replied calmly. Suddenly, the crowd parted violently as Jasmine stormed through. Her face was contorted with fury, her bridal sash flying behind her. She had heard everything. Her perfect high society aesthetic had just been publicly destroyed. She marched straight up to me, her chest heaving. You miserable, jealous witch, Jasmine screamed. Jasmine raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The force of the blow turned my head. My cheek burned instantly. My father stood immobile. My mother covered her mouth, looking at Caroline to see if the slap had appeased her. I slowly turned my head back to face my sister. I did not raise my hand. I did not yell. I simply reached up and carefully straightened the collar of my dress. I looked into Jasmine's furious, tear-filled eyes, knowing what I knew about her offshore accounts, knowing exactly what her beloved Preston was planning to do to her. I leaned in close so only she could hear me. I was going to save you, I whispered. Not anymore. I walked out of that country club with my cheek still burning from where Jasmine had struck me. I did not shed a single tear. I drove home in absolute silence, the finality of what had just happened settling heavily over me. My own sister had physically assaulted me in front of a room full of strangers to defend the very people who were actively destroying our family. My parents had watched it happen and done absolutely nothing. The line had been permanently crossed. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to people who were determined to misunderstand me. And in that moment, I let the burden go completely. I woke up at 6 the next morning to my phone ringing incessantly. It was Marcus, my chief operating officer. He sounded breathless and panicked. He told me to turn on the news and check my social media immediately. I opened my laptop and my stomach dropped. Jasmine had not wasted a single second. She was a senior executive at a top public relations firm in Atlanta, and she had weaponized her entire corporate network against me overnight. Articles were already popping up on financial blogs and local news websites. Blind items were trending across social media platforms. They accused Apex Ventures of predatory lending, racial discrimination against minority startups, and fraudulent accounting practices. The narrative was carefully and maliciously crafted to trigger maximum public outrage. Jasmine was painting me as a self-hating corporate tyrant who stepped on her own people to climb the ladder, claiming I actively killed deals for minority founders out of pure spite. Anonymous sources, which I knew with absolute certainty were just Jasmine and Preston, fed stories to journalists about how I was destroying local businesses. My inbox was overflowing with hate mail. My firm's stock valuation was already taking a hit in the pre-market trading. Jasmine was trying to burn my entire empire to the ground to force my hand. She genuinely believed that the public pressure and the threat of ruin would make me release the $20 million to Novatech just to save my reputation. By 8 o'clock, I was walking into my boardroom. My board of directors was in full panic mode. Older men in expensive suits were pacing the floor demanding we issue an immediate press release threatening to step down if the discrimination rumors were not addressed before noon. They wanted me to cave. They wanted me to fund Novatech just to make the bad press disappear and protect their portfolios. I stood at the head of the table and slammed my leather binder down, the sharp sound instantly silencing the room. I looked at each of them, my expression completely devoid of emotion, and told them to sit down. I flatly refused to issue a public denial. A denial makes you look defensive, I explained to the room of sweating executives. It gives the accusations oxygen and validates the narrative. Let them talk. Let them think they are winning. We do not negotiate with corporate terrorists. I knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. Jasmine and Preston were bleeding. Preston's credit cards were likely maxing out, and the walls were rapidly closing in on his massive mountain of debt. The smear campaign was a desperate thrashing move from a drowning man. They needed cash immediately, not just to fund their lavish lifestyle, but to keep Preston's ridiculous shell game from collapsing before he could secure his high society wedding. I realized in that moment that I could use their overwhelming desperation against them. I retreated to my private office, locked the door, and made a secure call to a trusted corporate attorney based in Delaware. I instructed him to immediately reactivate a dormant shell corporation I had set up years ago for anonymous real estate acquisitions. The company was buried under layers of legal protection and had no traceable ties to me or to Apex Ventures. I told my attorney to reach out directly to Preston under the guise of an independent private equity group. The bait was simple and incredibly dangerous. We would offer Novatech a highly predatory short-term bridge loan of $5 million. The interest rate was extortionate. The terms were absolutely brutal. Any sane, legitimate businessman would run the other way the second they read the contract. But Preston was not a sane businessman. He was a cornered fraudster desperate to keep up appearances for his arrogant mother and his oblivious future in-laws. My attorney called me back less than 2 hours later. Preston had taken the bait immediately. He did not even try to negotiate the punishing interest rate. He just wanted the $5 million wired into his accounts by the end of the week. But a loan of that magnitude required significant tangible collateral. My attorney had asked Preston what assets he could leverage to secure the funds. Novatech had zero tangible assets, just leased computer servers and empty promises. Preston confidently told the attorney he had personal real estate he could put up against the loan to guarantee the money. I sat at my desk, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline, waiting for the secure file to come through from Delaware. When the email finally chimed, my hands were surprisingly steady. I opened the attached document. It was the collateral agreement Preston had signed and submitted for the $5 million. I scrolled down and zoomed in on the scanned deed he had offered to secure the funds. My breath caught in my throat. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. It was the deed to my parents' house, the beautiful generational home my father had already secretly mortgaged to give Preston that initial $2 million bridge loan. But that was not the part that made my blood run completely cold. I stared at the bottom of the final page where the homeowner had to formally authorize the property to be used as collateral. There in jagged, unfamiliar ink was my father DeMarcus's signature. I knew my father's handwriting perfectly. I had seen him sign thousands of checks, permission slips, and report cards over the course of my life. The signature glowing on my computer screen was completely fake. Preston had not just lied about his failing company. He had actively forged my father's signature to steal the deed to my family's home right behind their backs. I barely slept that night. The glowing screen of my laptop displaying my father's forged signature burned into my retinas long after I closed it. I had the power to destroy Preston right then and there, to call the authorities and have him arrested for wire fraud and forgery. But pulling the trigger too early would only allow my parents to paint him as a victim of a misunderstanding. I needed to let the rope play out just a little bit further. That meant waking up the next morning, putting on a pristine tailored suit, and driving to Ebenezer Baptist, the absolute crown jewel of Atlanta's affluent Black elite. My family had attended this church for 3 decades. My father was the head deacon. My mother directed the women's auxiliary. It was their ultimate stage, the place where their carefully crafted social image was worshipped every single Sunday. When I walked through the heavy oak doors into the grand foyer, the performance was already in full swing. DeMarcus and Valerie were practically glowing, parading Preston around the congregation like a prized trophy. They introduced him to doctors, judges, and local politicians, loudly bragging about his brilliant tech startup and his old money lineage. Jasmine clung to his arm, flashing her enormous diamond ring at anyone who made eye contact. I watched my mother wave her manicured hand, completely ignoring my presence, as I stood just a few feet away. She leaned into the ear of a prominent judge's wife, her voice carrying over the chatter, saying how blessed they were to have a real visionary joining the family, actively contrasting him with the disappointments she had to endure. The blatant disrespect was breathtaking. They were actively mortgaging their entire existence for a man who had secretly stolen the deed to their home just 12 hours prior. I took my seat in the third pew, maintaining a mask of complete indifference. Preston caught my eye and smirked clearly, believing his coordinated online smear campaign had successfully backed me into a corner. He thought my silence was surrender. The service began with the usual grandeur, the choir swaying in their vibrant robes, the congregation settling into the plush pews. But when the pastor took the pulpit, the atmosphere shifted. He adjusted his glasses, looked directly at our family's pew, and launched into a fiery sermon centered entirely on the concept of family loyalty. He preached about the biblical duty to honor thy father and mother, to uplift one's siblings, and the spiritual rot of selfishness and greed. He spoke of the dangers of hoarding wealth while your own blood suffered, looking right at me as he delivered the lines. It was not a general message. It was a targeted precision strike. I watched my father nod vigorously, letting out loud murmurs of agreement. My mother cast a sideways, sanctimonious glance in my direction. The realization hit me like a physical blow. DeMarcus had bought and paid for this sermon. He had used his influence as head deacon to turn the pulpit into a weapon against me, weaponizing our faith community to publicly shame me into releasing the $20 million funding. He was trying to break my spirit in front of the very people I had grown up with, using the word of God to manipulate me into funding a fraudster. I sat perfectly still, refusing to lower my head or break eye contact with the pastor. I would not give them the satisfaction of looking ashamed. As the sermon dragged on, Preston leaned over and whispered something into Jasmine's ear, causing her to giggle quietly. They were entirely in their element, thoroughly enjoying the public crucifixion of my character. When the final hymn concluded, the congregation spilled out into the fellowship hall for coffee and mingling. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the suffocating hum of high society gossip. I needed a moment to breathe to escape the overwhelming hypocrisy of the room. I slipped away down a quiet carpeted hallway leading toward the administrative offices, intending to exit through the side doors and wait by my car. As I passed the pastor's private study, I noticed the heavy wooden door was cracked open just an inch. I heard my father's booming voice, but it lacked its usual arrogant resonance. It sounded thin, strained, and almost frantic. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back against the wall, and listened. The pastor was speaking in a harsh, panicked whisper. "DeMarcus, the bank called me on Friday afternoon. The account is completely drained. I need to know where the $500,000 from the new building fund went. The contractor needs his deposit tomorrow morning, or we lose the land we spent 5 years praying for." My father let out a ragged breath. I heard him stammering his words, tripping over each other in a desperate scramble. "Pastor, just give me a few more days. It is just a temporary transfer, an investment. It is going to yield a massive, unprecedented return for the congregation. I promise you the money is completely secure in a European account. I just need until the end of the week." A cold, terrifying dread washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. My father had not just emptied his personal retirement accounts and secretly mortgaged the ancestral home for Preston's fake bridge loan. He had crossed a line so catastrophic there was no turning back. DeMarcus had abused his position as head deacon to embezzle $500,000 of the church's money. He had handed over the community's donations to a white con man just for the sake of buying his way into an elite social circle. The interception happened the moment the pastor rushed out of the study, his face pale and glistening with a cold, terrified sweat. As soon as his rapid footsteps faded down the corridor, I stepped out of the shadows and pushed the heavy oak door open. I walked into my father's private administrative office and closed the door behind me, turning the brass deadbolt with a sharp, definitive click. DeMarcus spun around, startled by the sound. The imposing, untouchable patriarch who had just spent the last hour proudly parading his future son-in-law around the congregation was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, hyperventilating old man. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. His tie was loosened, and he was gripping the edge of his mahogany desk just to keep his hands from shaking. $500,000, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the rage I thought I would feel. "You stole $500,000 from the community building fund." He tried to summon his usual bluster, squaring his shoulders and puffing out his chest. "You have no idea what you are talking about, Aaliyah. This is a private church matter. You have no business eavesdropping on official administrative conversations." I walked slowly toward his desk, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. "I am not a teenager you can intimidate anymore, Dad. I heard every single word. You embezzled from the very people who just prayed with you. You took the congregation's money and handed it to Preston." The remaining color drained from his face. His knees buckled and he collapsed heavily into his leather executive chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a ragged, pathetic sob. The facade had completely shattered. "He promised me a 300% return." DeMarcus choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "He showed me the projections, Aaliyah. He said the European patents were going to finalize in days, and he just needed temporary liquidity to clear the international red tape. If I gave him the $500,000, he was going to pay it back before the wedding, plus a massive dividend for the church. It was supposed to be a guaranteed win. I was going to be the man who single-handedly funded the new sanctuary. I was going to show the Thorntons that our family was just as powerful, just as wealthy as they were." I stared down at him, utterly repulsed by the sheer depth of his vanity. "You risked federal prison just to buy bragging rights at a country club?" I said, the disgust practically dripping from my words. DeMarcus suddenly looked up, his eyes wide and frantic. He lunged forward, grabbing my wrists across the desk. His grip was tight, desperate, completely stripped of any parental dignity. "You have to help me, Aaliyah," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You said your firm manages billions. You have the money. You can write a check right now." Just replace the 500,000 before the audit committee meets on Monday morning. Use your billionaire money to fix this. If the bank reports the missing funds, I will go to federal prison. I will lose everything. The community will be destroyed. Please, you are my daughter. You have to save me. I looked down at his desperate, pleading hands, and then I calmly pulled my wrists free. When I was 19 years old, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper, I came to you begging for a simple loan. I was working 3 minimum wage jobs, trying to build my first software company, and I was 2 months behind on my rent. I asked you for $1,000 just to keep a roof over my head while I coded. Do you remember what you told me, Dad? He swallowed hard, looking away, unable to meet my gaze. You told me that failures do not get bailouts. I continued, forcing him to listen to his own cruelty. You told me I was a disappointment for dropping out of pre-med and that letting me get evicted would build my character. You were perfectly willing to let your own black daughter starve on the streets. But a slick white con man smiles at you, flashes a fake Rolex, and promises you a seat at his country club table, and you gladly commit a federal felony for him. You stole from your own people to fund his illusion. I am not writing you a check, Dad. I am not saving you from your own greed. His desperation instantly curdled into a bitter, venomous anger. He stood up, wiping his face, his pride demanding he defend his terrible choices. You do not understand high-level business. He spat, his voice shaking with resentment. Preston is a visionary. The money is perfectly safe in a secure European account. He assured me it is just a simple wire delay. The funds will be back in the church account by Friday, right before the wedding. Preston is family now. He would never betray us. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my tablet. My investigative team had been tracking every single move Preston made since he foolishly offered my proxy company the forged deed to our ancestral home. I tapped the screen and slid the tablet across the mahogany desk. Take a good look at your visionary dad, I said. DeMarcus frowned, picking up the tablet. His eyes scanned the digital document displayed on the screen. Preston has been bragging to Jasmine and the entire congregation that he booked a luxury honeymoon in the Maldives, I said, watching my father's eyes widen as he read the data. But those are official flight logs my security team pulled this morning. Preston does not have a honeymoon booked. What he has is a single first-class one-way ticket to Geneva, Switzerland. DeMarcus began to shake his hand, trembling so violently he nearly dropped the tablet. Check the departure time, I instructed coldly. My father let out a quiet gasp. The departure was scheduled for Saturday night, the exact time the wedding reception was supposed to be taking place. He is not marrying Jasmine, I stated, laying out the brutal, undeniable truth. He has absolutely no intention of showing up to that altar. He is draining your accounts. He is taking the church's money. And he is fleeing the country with every single dime he stole from you. He is leaving your golden child humiliated in a white dress, and he is leaving you here to take the fall for a federal crime. DeMarcus dropped the tablet onto the desk. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall as he slid down until he was sitting on the floor of his pristine office, staring blankly ahead. The patriarch, who had demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, was finally realizing he had just engineered his own complete and total destruction. I left my father weeping on the floor of his pristine church office. The drive from Ebenezer Baptist to Jasmine's luxury high-rise in Buckhead was a blur of neon traffic lights and the steady rhythmic drumming of my own pulse. I had told Jasmine at the bridal shower that I was no longer going to save her. I had looked my sister in the eye and promised her that she was on her own. But as I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, the reality of Preston's grand illusion gnawed at whatever remaining conscience I possessed. Preston was not just a grifter. He was a highly dangerous predator. And despite the endless cruelty my sister had inflicted upon me over the years, the thought of her standing alone at the altar in her custom ivory gown, while the man she loved vanished across the Atlantic Ocean, felt like a punishment too severe even for her. I convinced myself that I was making this trip simply to deliver the facts. I was not there to comfort her. I was not there to fix her life. I was there to hand her the absolute truth and finally walk away with clean hands. I bypassed the concierge using the spare key card my mother had forced upon me months ago and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse. The doors slid open directly into Jasmine's sprawling living room. The massive space smelled of fresh eucalyptus and pure, unearned entitlement. Designer shopping bags from expensive European boutiques were scattered across the imported Italian leather sofas. Half-packed luxury suitcases lined the hallway. Jasmine emerged from the kitchen wearing silk loungewear, holding a crystal glass half full of mimosa. When she saw me standing in her foyer, her face twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. "How did you get in here?" Jasmine demanded, setting her drink down hard on the marble kitchen island. "I told security you were explicitly banned from this building. If you are here to cry about the public relations campaign I launched against your firm, you can save your breath. You are going to release that $20 million funding to Preston, or I am going to make sure your name is synonymous with corporate fraud for the rest of your natural life." I did not take the bait. I walked slowly into the center of the living room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. "I am not here about the money," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am here because my investigative team just pulled Preston's private flight logs. He does not have a honeymoon suite booked in the Maldives, Jasmine. He has a single first-class one-way ticket to Geneva, Switzerland. The flight departs at 8 o'clock on Saturday night, right in the middle of your wedding reception. He is leaving you." I watched her face, waiting for the devastating realization to set in. I waited for the tears, the denial, the crushing heartbreak of a woman discovering that her entire future was a carefully constructed lie. Instead, Jasmine stared at me for a long, silent moment, and then she began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle and quickly escalated into a bright, maniacal, terrifying laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the penthouse. She picked up her mimosa, took a slow sip, and looked at me with an expression of profound, mocking pity. "You really think I am just some naive little girl, do you not?" Jasmine asked, walking over to her designer handbag resting on the console table. "You think you are the only one in this family with a brain?" She reached into her purse, pulled out a thick envelope, and tossed it onto the coffee table right in front of me. The flap fell open, revealing the crisp printed itinerary inside. I looked down. It was a matching first-class one-way ticket to Geneva. "I am not a victim, Aaliyah," Jasmine sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. "Preston and I planned this together months ago. We knew your board of directors would stall the major funding, so we needed immediate capital to secure our life in Europe. Preston took a $5 million loan from a private equity firm, and the second the funds clear on Friday, we are leaving. The wedding is just a distraction. It is a grand finale to keep Mom and Dad busy, paying vendors while we fly out to our new lives." I stared at my sister, feeling a deep, physical chill settle into my bones. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She was not a pawn in Preston's game. She was his willing accomplice. "You are stealing the money," I stated, the horror finally creeping into my voice. "Do you have any idea where that collateral came from?" Jasmine Preston forged Dad's signature on the deed to the family house to secure that loan. And Dad embezzled $500,000 from the church building fund just to keep Preston afloat. When that $5 million loan defaults, they are going to take the house. When the church audit hits on Monday, the authorities are going to arrest Dad. He is going to federal prison. Jasmine waved her manicured hand dismissively, completely unfazed by the reality of our family's impending destruction. "Dad is old," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with callous entitlement. "He has lived his life. He can do a few years in a minimum security facility. He will be fine, and Mom will just have to downsize. They brought this on themselves by trying to buy their way into high society. I deserve to be a wealthy European socialite, Aaliyah. I deserve to live without limits. If Mom and Dad have to be the stepping stones for my elevation, then that is their duty as my parents." I stood frozen in the center of the penthouse. The last lingering shred of sibling loyalty I harbored evaporated into thin air. I was no longer looking at my sister. I was looking at a sociopathic parasite. Jasmine checked her diamond watch and sighed loudly. Now, if you are done playing the morality police, you need to get out, Jasmine demanded, pointing toward the elevator. Preston's mother, Caroline, is on her way up right now. She is bringing the final notary paperwork to legally transfer the deed of Dad's house to the trust before the loan clears. We have real business to finish, and your negative energy is ruining my morning. I looked at Jasmine, my face completely devoid of emotion. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply nodded, accepting the absolute finality of the situation. I understand completely, I said, turning toward the door. I wish you the life you deserve. As I walked toward the elevator, I purposefully let my designer purse slip from my shoulder. It hit the hardwood floor, spilling a few items across the plush rug. Jasmine rolled her eyes and turned back toward the kitchen to refill her glass. I knelt down to gather my things. With swift practiced precision, I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out a microscopic voice-activated audio recorder. It was a high-tech device I kept for hostile corporate negotiations. As I picked up my lipstick, I reached out and firmly stuck the magnetic recorder completely out of sight beneath the edge of the velvet sofa, right where Caroline and Jasmine would be sitting. I stood up, slung my purse over my shoulder, and stepped into the elevator. As the steel doors slid shut, separating me from my sister forever, a cold, ruthless smile finally spread across my face. The trap was armed. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the heavily tinted windows shielding me from the bright Atlanta sun. The engine purred silently as I synced my phone to the microscopic audio transmitter I had just planted under Jasmine's velvet sofa. The encrypted application opened, and a crystal-clear audio feed instantly flooded through my car speakers. I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass, the rustle of silk clothing, and the heavy, arrogant footsteps of my sister pacing her penthouse. A few minutes later, the sharp chime of the private elevator echoed through the feed. The heavy doors slid open. I heard Preston's slick, overly confident voice greeting my sister, followed immediately by the clipped, aristocratic tones of his mother, Caroline. They exchanged the usual hollow pleasantries, air kisses, and exaggerated compliments about the view from the penthouse. But the conversational shift happened almost instantly. The moment they sat down right above my hidden microphone, the polite facade vanished entirely. Preston let out a loud, mocking sigh of relief. He sounded completely different when he was not performing for my parents. His voice dropped an octave, dripping with absolute contempt. He asked Jasmine if she had packed her bags, and when she proudly confirmed she was ready for Geneva, Preston and Caroline launched into a brutal, unrestrained dissection of my family. Caroline laughed, a sharp, grating sound that filled the cabin of my car. She talked about how painfully easy it had been to extract the deed to the ancestral home from DeMarcus. She actually used the phrase, status-obsessed black family, marveling at how desperately my parents craved the validation of a white old money lineage. She joked that they were so eager to buy their way into a country club fantasy that they essentially wrapped a bow around their generational wealth and handed it over without asking a single real question. Preston chimed in, his amusement making my stomach churn. He brought up the church funds. He proudly recounted how he had subtly manipulated DeMarcus's fragile ego, convincing a respected head deacon to embezzle $500,000 from his own congregation. Preston called my father a pathetic social climbing fool who cared more about appearing wealthy to his peers than honoring his own faith. They laughed at my mother, Valerie, mocking her frantic attempts to impress Caroline with name-dropping and expensive catering. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Hearing my family's vanity thrown back in their faces by the very parasites they worshipped was a completely different kind of agony. Jasmine laughed right along with them. My own sister sat there sipping her mimosa, giggling as the people who had given her everything were brutally humiliated and financially destroyed. Then the audio feed picked up the sound of a champagne cork popping. Jasmine cheerfully announced that they needed a proper toast to celebrate their impending escape. She told Preston and Caroline she was going into the master suite to retrieve a vintage bottle of Dom Perignon she had been saving for the occasion. Her footsteps faded away down the long corridor, followed by the heavy thud of a solid oak door closing. The living room was suddenly very quiet. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound coming through my car speakers was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. And then Caroline spoke. Her voice was no longer the warm, conspiratorial tone she had just used with my sister. It was ice cold, utterly ruthless, and strictly business. "Are the offshore accounts fully transferred?" Caroline asked, her tone sharp and impatient. Preston replied instantly, matching her cold efficiency. "Every single one. I finalized the wire routing this morning. The $5 million loan has been successfully dispersed into the shell companies, and the church's $500,000 is already sitting in the Cayman Islands." Carolyn let out a tight breath of satisfaction. "And the liability paperwork?" Preston chuckled, but there was zero warmth in the sound. "It is a masterpiece. I had Jasmine sign the final batch of proxy documents last night, under the guise of our marriage license applications. She did not even read them. Her signature is now the sole authorizing mandate on every fraudulent offshore account we created. She is the official guarantor of the $5 million bridge loan, and she is listed as the primary beneficiary of the embezzled church funds." I stopped breathing. The air in my car suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. "Are you absolutely certain her Geneva ticket is canceled?" Caroline asked. "I canceled it the moment she paid for it," Preston confirmed. "She thinks we are boarding a private charter at 8 o'clock on Saturday. But I'm leaving on a commercial flight out of JFK tomorrow morning, and you are flying out of Miami tonight. By the time Jasmine is standing at the altar in her ridiculous white dress wondering where I am, the bank's automated fraud detection will trigger the default protocol. They will freeze her assets, seize DeMarcus's house, and alert federal authorities to the offshore tax evasion. Jasmine is going to take the fall for the entire operation. She will be looking at 20 years in federal prison, and we will be completely untouchable in Switzerland." The sheer predatory evil of their plan washed over me. Jasmine thought she was the apex predator, the brilliant mastermind, escaping to a life of European luxury. She genuinely believed she was outsmarting everyone. But she was nothing more than the sacrificial lamb. Preston and Caroline had spent months carefully building a financial guillotine, and they had just convinced my sister to place her own head on the block. They were going to leave her holding the bag for $5.5 million of stolen money. They were going to let the FBI tear her life apart while they vanished into thin air. I sat in the silence of my car as Jasmine's footsteps echoed back into the living room, completely oblivious to the fact that her future had just been violently erased. I listened to the pop of the champagne, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the sickening sound of my sister toasting to her own destruction. I reached up and killed the audio feed. The sudden silence in the car was deafening. My sister was a monster. My parents were fools. But Preston and Caroline had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed the quiet, estranged daughter was just a bitter failure with no resources. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. I picked up my phone and bypassed my usual contacts, scrolling straight to the encrypted number for the lead attorney at my wealth management firm. He answered on the first ring. "I need you to execute a hostile acquisition immediately," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "Find the proxy company holding the $5 million predatory loan issued to Preston Thornton. I do not care what the premium is. Use our unlisted subsidiary accounts and buy that debt outright. Once the paper is securely in our possession, I want you to call in the loan. Do it right now. Trigger the default clause and lock every single account associated with that transaction. I am slamming the cage shut." The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the rehearsal dinner, illuminating a room built entirely on lies. It was Friday night, exactly 24 hours before the wedding was supposed to take place. I sat at the far end of the long banquet table, quietly sipping sparkling water, watching the spectacular theater unfold before me. The floral centerpieces alone cost more than most people earned in a year, overflowing with imported white orchids and cascading greenery. My mother Valerie was practically vibrating with nervous energy. She wore a forced, brilliant smile, but I could see the rigid tension in her shoulders. She was frantically trying to manage the waitstaff signaling for more champagne, desperate to maintain the illusion of unlimited generational wealth. Beside her, my father, DeMarcus, looked physically ill. He was sweating through his bespoke tuxedo, gripping his napkin so tightly his knuckles were white. He was carrying the crushing weight of the $500,000 he had stolen from the church, praying that Preston's mythical European transfer would clear the next morning so he could replace the funds before Monday's audit. He was a man standing on a trapdoor begging the executioner not to pull the lever. Directly across from me sat Preston and his mother, Caroline. Caroline was in her absolute element, acting like a deposed queen holding court among the peasants. She spoke loudly about their non-existent family estates in France, casually waving her hand to dismiss a waiter who had poured her wine slightly off-center. Preston sat next to her, exuding the smug, untouchable arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully stolen $5.5 million. And then there was Jasmine. My sister was radiant, positively glowing with arrogant triumph. She wore a silk designer dress, laughing loudly at every joke Preston made. She kept shooting me these deeply condescending looks, silently gloating. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she was hours away from boarding a first-class flight to Geneva with her wealthy European prince, leaving our parents completely bankrupt and facing federal prison. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. I maintained a mask of absolute serene indifference. Not a single person at that table knew that less than 24 hours ago, my lead attorney had executed a hostile acquisition. They did not know my firm had aggressively bought out the predatory $5 million loan Preston had taken using my father's forged deed. They had no idea that I was no longer just the estranged sister. I was their sole creditor. As the main course was cleared away by a small army of waiters, DeMarcus stood up. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clinking sound brought the room to a sudden hush. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo jacket, trying to summon the booming, authoritative voice he used at the pulpit, but it sounded thin and reedy. Family and distinguished guests. DeMarcus began, offering a wavering smile. Tonight we celebrate the merging of two great legacies. When I look at Jasmine and Preston, I do not just see a beautiful couple, I see the future. I see a young man of extraordinary vision, impeccable character, and profound business acumen. Preston, you are the perfect future son-in-law. You have brought unparalleled opportunity into our lives, and we entrust our most precious treasure to you. My mother nodded tearfully, raising her glass. Jasmine beamed, reaching out to grasp Preston's hand. Preston offered a humble, practiced nod, playing the role of the honorable groom to absolute perfection. But just as DeMarcus opened his mouth to continue his lavish praise, the heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open. The general manager of the country club walked in, his face tight with a mixture of profound embarrassment and urgent panic. He completely ignored my father standing at the head of the table mid-speech. Instead, he walked briskly across the room, heading straight for Preston. The manager leaned down, shielding his mouth with his hand, and whispered frantically into Preston's ear. The smug, aristocratic smile vanished from Preston's face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He shook his head sharply, reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a heavy metal credit card and shoved it into the manager's hand, muttering something about a bank error. The manager nodded, tightly, turned on his heel, and rushed back out of the room. DeMarcus cleared his throat, trying to regain the room's attention, attempting to weave a joke about wedding weekend logistics. But the atmosphere had already shifted. A cold, heavy tension settled over the white tablecloths. Less than 2 minutes later, the manager returned. This time, he did not whisper. He stood right behind Preston's chair, holding a small black leather folio, looking deeply apologetic but uncompromising. "I am so sorry, sir," the manager said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "That card declined as well. I have tried all 4 accounts you provided on file for the $40,000 rehearsal dinner balance. Every single one has been flagged and completely frozen. Your bank is citing a catastrophic default. We need alternative payment immediately, or I am instructed to call local authorities for theft of services." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. My mother let out a small, strangled cry, dropping her champagne flute onto the table. It shattered, spilling wine across the pristine linen. DeMarcus collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving as the horrific reality began to set in. Jasmine whipped her head toward Preston, her eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. "Preston, what is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Tell him to run it again." Preston was hyperventilating. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He tapped frantically, opening his banking applications. I watched his eyes dart back and forth, reflecting the stark red warning banners flashing across his screen. The $5 million loan had not just failed to clear, the accounts were entirely locked, seized, and frozen by my legal team. The escape funds were gone. Caroline stood up, her regal composure completely shattering. "There must be a mistake," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the manager. "Do you know who we are?" I decided it was time to end the show. I stood up slowly, the sound of my chair sliding back, cutting through the panicked silence. I smoothed the front of my dress, opened my purse, and pulled out my solid titanium black card. I walked calmly down the length of the table, the eyes of every single person tracking my movements. I handed the card directly to the manager. "Run this for the 40,000, I said, my voice smooth and authoritative. "Add a 20% gratuity for your staff. I apologize for the disruption." The manager let out a massive sigh of relief, bowed his head respectfully, and quickly exited the room. I stood right behind Preston. He was still frantically swiping at his phone, sweating profusely, muttering under his breath. I placed my hands on the back of his chair, leaning down until my lips were just inches from his ear. "Your $5 million loan is in catastrophic default, Preston," I whispered, ensuring every syllable was perfectly clear. "My firm bought the debt this morning. We called it in 3 hours ago. We now own your fake startup. We own your leased luxury cars. And we hold the absolute, unquestionable deed to my father's house. You are completely bankrupt, and you are surrounded by people you just tried to destroy. I suggest you take whatever dignity you have left and walk out that door. You have exactly 24 hours to run before I hand the church embezzlement files and your offshore tax fraud documents directly to the FBI." Preston recoiled from my whisper, as if I had just plunged a physical blade directly into his ribs. All the color instantly drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving behind a sickly, chalky pallor. He stumbled backward, his chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute. The arrogant, aristocratic heir who had spent the last 6 months mocking my family was completely gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate fraudster staring at the very person who had just dismantled his entire life. The rest of the private dining room remained paralyzed in a suffocating, awkward tension. The waitstaff had silently vanished after I handed over my titanium card, leaving the elite guests to process the bizarre spectacle that had just unfolded. DeMarcus was still slumped in his chair at the head of the table, staring blankly at his empty plate, clearly realizing that the financial guillotine was already dropping. Caroline sat rigid, her lips pursed in aristocratic fury, completely oblivious to the fact that her son was currently calculating how fast he could flee the state. Preston did not say a word to me. He could not. He simply grabbed Jasmine by the arm, pulling her away from the table with a sudden, frantic urgency. I watched them retreat to a secluded corner near the heavy velvet drapes. Preston was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand as he spoke to my sister in rapid, hushed tones. He was spinning the lie, weaving a frantic story about a massive bank error, a frozen corporate account, and a temporary hold on his trust fund. He promised her it was a simple misunderstanding that his wealth manager would resolve by morning. And Jasmine, wrapped in her impenetrable delusion, simply nodded, soothing his arm, completely blind to the fact that her wealthy prince was currently bleeding out financially on the country club floor. I turned to gather my purse, intending to leave the shattered remains of the rehearsal dinner behind me. But before I could take a single step toward the exit, my mother intercepted me. Valerie marched across the dining room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. Her face was flushed with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and profound misdirected rage. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging painfully into my skin, pulling me into the empty corridor just outside the dining room doors. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Aaliyah?" Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with absolute fury. "How dare you create a scene like that in front of Caroline and our most important guests? Flaunting your money, stepping in to pay the bill as if Preston is some kind of charity case. You humiliated him. You humiliated this entire family." I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my arm and then up into her furious eyes. "I just saved you from the police being called to your country club, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm, contrasting sharply with her manic energy. "Your visionary son-in-law could not afford his own rehearsal dinner." Valerie let go of my arm as if she had been burned, but her anger only intensified. "It was a banking error," she spat, repeating the exact lie Preston was currently feeding Jasmine. "Caroline already explained it to me. Their international accounts have strict security protocols. But you just could not wait to swoop in and play the hero, could you? You could not stand to see your sister happy for one single evening without trying to ruin it." I stared at the woman who had birthed me, feeling a profound hollow emptiness, where my childhood longing for her affection used to reside. She was staring at financial ruin, federal prison for her husband, and the absolute destruction of her social standing, but all she cared about was the illusion. She cared more about protecting the image of a wealthy white son-in-law than she cared about the daughter who had just bailed them out. "I want to know exactly what you whispered to him," Valerie demanded, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Whatever venom you spat at him, whatever jealous, petty threat you made, you are going to march right back into that dining room and fix it. Do you hear me, Aaliyah? You will go back in there, you will apologize to Preston and Caroline, and you will fix whatever you just broke. You will not ruin your sister's high society wedding." I simply looked at her. I did not feel the need to shout or cry or explain the devastating reality that was about to crash down on her carefully curated life. I felt completely devoid of emotion. The anger was gone. The resentment was gone. They were strangers to me now, trapped in a burning house they had built themselves. "I am not fixing anything, Mom," I said, my voice soft but carrying an undeniable absolute finality. "The wedding is already over." I turned my back on her, leaving Valerie standing alone in the luxurious country club corridor. I walked out the heavy glass front doors into the cool, crisp night air, handed my ticket to the valet, and drove away from my family for the very last time. The drive back to my secure high-rise in the city was quiet and peaceful. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat in the dark living room, looking out over the glittering skyline. I had given Preston a 24-hour head start. It was a calculated risk, a psychological test to see if he would try to fight the corporate acquisition or if his cowardice would override his greed. I did not have to wait long for the answer. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the encrypted security phone resting on my glass coffee table lit up with a bright flashing red alert. The jarring electronic chime shattered the silence of the apartment. I set my glass down and picked up the device, pressing the biometric scanner to unlock the secure channel. It was the lead director of my private security detail, the team I had assigned to monitor Preston's every physical movement since the offshore accounts were seized. "We have a major situation, ma'am," the security director said, his voice tight and professional, cutting through the static of the encrypted line. "The target is on the move. He is not waiting for the 24-hour window to close." I stood up, walking slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Where is he?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He is at the Hawthorne private airstrip on the outskirts of the city." The director reported, the sound of a revving engine audible in the background of the call. "He bypassed his apartment completely after the country club. He showed up here in a rideshare vehicle carrying 2 duffel bags. He is currently attempting to board a chartered Gulfstream jet. He is making a run for it a day early, ma'am. He is trying to leave the country right now." A cold, ruthless smile spread across my face as I stared out at the city lights. Preston Thornton thought he could outrun a financial empire. He thought he could steal from my family and quietly slip into the night. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you try to flee from a predator who already owns the cage. I did not waste a single second. I immediately instructed my security director to deploy the tactical interception team and intercept my car on the interstate. Within 10 minutes, I was speeding down the desolate, rain-slicked highway, flanked by two matte black security SUVs. The Hawthorne Private Airstrip was a discreet, lightly regulated facility favored by wealthy executives and apparently fleeing criminals. As we approached the perimeter, my lead security officer bypassed the automated gate using a localized override code. We rolled onto the darkened tarmac, in perfect synchronization, our headlights completely extinguished. Through the windshield, I saw exactly what my team had reported. A sleek twin-engine Gulfstream jet sat idling on the runway, its navigation lights blinking rhythmically against the dense night fog. The boarding stairs were lowered to the asphalt, and parked right next to them was a nondescript black sedan. Preston and Caroline were in an absolute state of frantic panic. They were no longer the refined, aristocratic elites who sipped vintage champagne and mocked my family lineage. They were common thieves scrambling in the dark. Preston's expensive tuxedo jacket was discarded on the wet ground. He was violently tossing heavy leather duffel bags from the trunk of the car onto the tarmac. Caroline, her hair severely disheveled and her designer gown ruined by the damp air, was frantically hauling a heavy velvet jewelry box up the narrow metal stairs of the aircraft. I signaled my driver. Instantly, my vehicle and the two escort SUVs surged forward, our high beams suddenly flooding the tarmac with blinding, aggressive light. The tires screeched as my driver expertly positioned our vehicle directly in front of the jet nose gear, physically blocking any possibility of a takeoff. The two security SUVs boxed in Preston's sedan from behind, trapping them completely. Preston dropped a heavy duffel bag in shock. It hit the pavement with a dull metallic thud, bursting partially open to reveal thick stacks of banded $100 bills in loose velvet pouches. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face. I walked slowly into the harsh glare of the headlights, my heels clicking rhythmically against the wet asphalt. Caroline shrieked, dropping a handful of diamond necklaces onto the metal stairs, scrambling backward in sheer terror. Preston, however, completely snapped. The polished, calculated grifter vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He let out a visceral scream and lunged directly at me, his fists clenched, intending to physically tear me apart. He did not even make it within 5 feet. Before I even had to flinch, 3 of my private security contractors materialized from the shadows of the SUVs. These were not ordinary guards. They were highly trained former military operatives. The lead contractor simply stepped into Preston's path, absorbed the impact of his charge without taking a single step backward, and drove a rigid forearm directly into Preston's chest. Preston collapsed onto the wet tarmac, gasping violently for air, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs. He scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the rough asphalt, staring up at the wall of armed men forming an impenetrable barrier around me. "You really are an absolute amateur, Preston," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the whine of the idling jet engines. "Did you honestly think you could just pack your bags and fly away after I told you my firm purchased your debt?" I stepped over the spilled duffel bag, looking down at the scattered bundles of cash and the glittering jewelry Caroline had abandoned. You see, I continued my tone, meticulously calm, when a $5 million loan enters catastrophic default. The issuing institution has the immediate legal right to seize all collateral and liquid assets to satisfy the debt. Because my firm now owns that paper, everything you possess legally belongs to me. That includes the fake shell company you established, the leased cars you abandoned, and those duffel bags full of cash you are frantically trying to load onto this aircraft. I looked up at Caroline, who was trembling violently on the airplane stairs, clutching the handrail for dear life. "You are not taking your personal wealth to Geneva," I stated, staring right through her. "You are attempting to transport stolen corporate collateral across international borders. That is no longer a simple civil default. That is federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and international smuggling. Preston remained on the ground, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between my security team, the blocked aircraft, and the spilled cash. The terrifying reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had no leverage. He had no escape route. He was entirely at my mercy, and he knew I had absolutely none to offer. "Please," Preston gasped, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. He actually raised his hands in a begging gesture. "You have the money. Just take the bags. Just let us get on the plane. We will never come back. Jasmine can have the house. We will disappear. I swear to you, we will just disappear." I looked down at him with a gaze so entirely devoid of emotion it felt sub-zero. "You do not get to negotiate the terms of your surrender," I stated softly. "You only get to choose how you are executed." I crossed my arms, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "Here is what is going to happen next. Option A. My security director makes a single phone call to the federal agents waiting discreetly outside the perimeter of this airstrip. They swarm this tarmac, slap you and your mother in handcuffs, and you spend the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security penitentiary for wire fraud." Preston swallowed hard, visibly trembling in the cold air. Or I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Option B. You gather your pathetic mother. You get back in that sedan and you drive back to your hotel. You wake up tomorrow morning, you put on your custom-tailored tuxedo and you show up at my parents' country club. You will stand at that altar, you will look deeply into my sister's eyes, you will smile for every single camera, and you will let Jasmine have the picture-perfect high society wedding of her dreams. You will play the devoted, wealthy groom to absolute perfection." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the magnitude of the ultimatum to settle over him. "You have a choice, Preston," I said, turning my back on him and walking slowly toward my waiting car. "You can get arrested right here on this wet tarmac in front of a rented jet, or you can walk down that aisle tomorrow. Choose right now." I listened to the quiet of the airstrip, broken only by the hum of the engines and Preston's ragged, defeated breathing. And then I heard the sound of absolute soul-crushing submission. "I will do it." Preston whimpered from the ground, his voice completely broken. "I will show up tomorrow. Just do not call the authorities. I will give her the wedding." I smiled into the darkness, opening my car door. The final piece of the board was set. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand bridal suite at the country club, casting a warm golden light over a room that felt entirely divorced from reality. I sat perfectly still in a high-backed velvet armchair, tucked into the far corner of the suite. I wore a tailored, deep emerald gown, my hair and makeup impeccably finished, looking every bit the supportive sister of the bride. No one looking at me would ever suspect that less than 8 hours ago, I had been standing on a freezing tarmac, holding the groom hostage with the threat of federal prison. The suite was a hurricane of frantic activity and suffocating entitlement. The air was thick with the scent of burning hairspray, expensive floral perfume, and pure, concentrated vanity. At the center of the chaos sat Jasmine. She was perched on a raised pedestal chair in front of a massive vanity mirror, draped in a white silk robe embroidered with the word bride in gold lettering. She was acting less like a woman preparing for her wedding day and more like a tyrannical queen preparing for her coronation. She was currently unleashing her wrath upon a team of highly paid makeup artists and hairstylists. I watched as she snatched a makeup brush out of a terrified young woman's hand and threw it across the room. It clattered against the hardwood floor. Jasmine practically shrieked that the blush was too warm, that it made her look like a commoner, and that if they ruined her photos, she would make sure they never worked in this city again. She demanded they start over for the third time. The young artist was visibly shaking, fighting back tears as she frantically searched her kit for a cooler shade of pink. Jasmine was completely drunk on her own manufactured reality. She genuinely believed that once the vows were spoken, she would be boarding a private jet to Geneva, leaving all her earthly problems behind, to live as European royalty. She had absolutely no idea that her one-way ticket had been canceled, her offshore accounts had been seized, and the man she was about to marry was only showing up today because he was terrified of being locked in a federal holding cell. Hovering just behind Jasmine's chair was our mother, Valerie. She was completely oblivious to the cruelty her daughter was inflicting on the hired staff. Valerie was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, weeping performative tears of absolute joy. She kept adjusting the placement of Jasmine's custom-imported veil, murmuring about how proud she was, how they had finally arrived, and how the entire congregation would be seething with jealousy when they saw the guest list. Valerie was treating this wedding not as a union of love, but as the ultimate social victory. She believed she had successfully engineered her family's permanent ascension into high society. The heavy wooden doors of the suite creaked open and my father walked in. The contrast between his demeanor and my mother's joyous delusion was staggering. DeMarcus looked terrible. His skin held a gray, sickly pallor and dark, heavy bags hung beneath his eyes. He was wearing his custom-tailored tuxedo, but it seemed to hang loosely on his frame as if he had aged 10 years overnight. He kept wiping his sweaty palms against his trousers, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I knew exactly what was running through his mind. Today was Saturday. The church audit was scheduled for Monday morning. $500,000 was missing from the building fund, and DeMarcus was clinging to a desperate, fraying thread of hope. Preston had undoubtedly spun him another brilliant lie late last night, probably claiming the delayed funds would magically clear into DeMarcus's account the moment the banks opened on Monday. My father was gambling his entire freedom on this wedding. He was looking at Preston not as a son-in-law, but as a lifeline. He genuinely believed that cementing this marriage would force Preston's wealthy family to cover his embezzlement tracks. DeMarcus was a desperate man praying for a miracle that I had already systematically dismantled. He walked over to Jasmine, forcing a weak, trembling smile, and kissed the top of her head. He told her she looked beautiful, but his voice shook, lacking any of its usual booming resonance. Jasmine barely acknowledged him, too busy complaining that her champagne flute was empty. As the stylists finally finished pinning her veil into place, Jasmine stood up. She admired her reflection in the full-length mirror, smoothing the bodice of her custom ivory gown. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly devoid of humanity. She turned away from the mirror, and her eyes found me sitting quietly in the corner. A wicked, condescending smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She walked slowly toward me, the heavy silk train of her gown whispering against the floorboards. She stopped just a few feet away, looking down at me as if I were a stain on her perfect day. "Try not to look too depressed when I walk down the aisle, Aaliyah." Jasmine sneered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I know it must be incredibly hard for you to sit there and watch me get everything you ever wanted, but try to force a smile. It is bad for the photos, and I want everything today to be absolutely flawless." I looked up into my sister's eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply offered her a slow, even nod. I was perfectly content to let her enjoy the very last moments of her delusion. "I will give you exactly the face you deserve today, Jasmine," I replied, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any emotion. Jasmine rolled her eyes, turning back to her entourage to demand they fetch her bouquet. As she walked away, I felt a sharp, distinct vibration against my thigh. I reached into the small emerald clutch resting on my lap and pulled out my encrypted phone. The screen illuminated with a secure text message from my lead attorney. I opened the message and read the words carefully. "The FBI has received the audio files regarding the church embezzlement and the offshore accounts. The Financial Fraud Division has verified the evidence. They are en route to the country club now." I stared at the glowing text, the final piece of the trap, locking securely into place. I typed out my response with slow, deliberate precision. "Hold them at the doors until the vows." I pressed send, slipped the phone back into my clutch, and stood up to join the wedding procession. It was time for the grand finale. The sanctuary of Ebenezer Baptist Church had been completely transformed into a suffocating, almost aggressive display of manufactured opulence. Thousands of imported white roses and heavy cascading hydrangeas spilled over every polished wooden pew and covered the massive altar in a blanket of pristine white. The vaulted ceilings echoed with the rich, swelling melodies of a live string orchestra playing from the upper balcony. The pews were packed tightly, shoulder to shoulder, with Atlanta's political elite corporate titans and the rigid old money country club set that Caroline had explicitly imported to legitimize the affair. The air felt thick and heavy, saturated with the competing scents of expensive floral perfumes, designer colognes, and the pure concentrated vanity of a family trying to buy their way into a social stratosphere they did not truly belong in. It was a perfectly staged production of wealth and status, and I sat right in the middle of it. I was positioned in the second row on the bride's side, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting quietly in my lap over my small emerald clutch. I watched the grand illusion unfold before me, with the calm, detached precision of a predator, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. Up at the front of the church, the illusion was already beginning to fracture and splinter, if you knew exactly where to look. Preston stood next to the officiant, but he looked absolutely nothing like a triumphant wealthy groom eagerly awaiting his bride. His custom-tailored bespoke tuxedo jacket seemed to hang awkwardly on his suddenly rigid frame. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture glistening on his forehead and upper lip under the harsh, bright sanctuary lights. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal calculating its absolute final, desperate leap for survival. He kept wiping his sweaty palms against his trousers, shifting his weight from foot to foot, utterly consumed by the knowledge that federal agents were currently converging on the building. In the front row directly across the aisle, Caroline sat completely frozen. Her usual aristocratic arrogance and sneering superiority had evaporated into thin air. Her neck was swiveling in sharp, erratic, terrified movements. Her wide eyes were constantly scanning the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary, the side emergency exits, and the stained glass windows. She looked exactly like a woman waiting for an executioner to enter the room. Then the heavy double wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary swung slowly open. The string orchestra shifted smoothly into a soaring dramatic rendition of the bridal chorus. The entire congregation rose to their feet in a massive synchronized wave of rustling silk taffeta and tailored wool. Jasmine appeared in the doorway, her arm linked tightly through our father's elbow. She looked absolutely breathtaking, wrapped in layers of custom-imported lace, wearing a cathedral-length veil that trails endlessly across the floor behind her. But her face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated, blinding triumph. She walked down the long, flower-lined aisle with the slow, deliberate, arrogant pacing of a conquering monarch claiming her throne. She was beaming, soaking in the collective admiration and envious whispers of the elite crowd. She was completely, totally convinced that she was taking her final steps toward an untouchable European dynasty. She kept her chin high, her smile radiant, looking flawlessly regal. She was utterly blind to the absolute terror radiating from the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. She thought she had outsmarted everyone, entirely oblivious to the fact that her fraudulent empire had already been reduced to ash. DeMarcus looked equally oblivious to Preston's visible panic, but for entirely different reasons. My father was shockingly pale, his breathing shallow and rapid, his face lined with the crushing, heavy exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 48 hours praying for a financial deliverance that would never arrive. He was clinging to the desperate belief that marrying his daughter off to this wealthy heir would somehow magically replace the $500,000 he had embezzled from the very church we were standing in. When they finally reached the altar, DeMarcus turned to face Preston. He placed Jasmine's gloved hand directly into Preston's cold, trembling palm. The small microphone clipped to the officiant's robe picked up the faint, incredibly desperate whisper my father offered to his future son-in-law. "Save our family, son." DeMarcus breathed, his voice thick with a pathetic, clinging hope that made my stomach turn. Preston flinched violently, as if the words had physically burned him, giving a stiff, jerky, terrified nod in response. DeMarcus took his seat next to my mother in the front row. Valerie immediately reached out and gripped his hand, her face completely awash in tears of profound, overwhelming social victory. The string quartet faded into a soft, reverent silence. The officiant stepped forward, opening his heavy leather-bound book. His deep, resonant voice carried easily through the massive, completely quiet sanctuary, weaving through the traditional solemn opening remarks about love duty and eternal commitment. He paused, letting the heavy weight of the moment settle over the hundreds of seated guests, and then he delivered the standard archaic line that had been spoken at thousands of weddings before this one. If anyone present knows cause, or just impediment, why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence was supposed to be a mere formality. Instead, I stood up. The sound of my heels sliding against the floor cut through the sanctuary like a gunshot. Instead, I moved. I stood up slowly from the second row, my deep emerald silk dress catching the light. The sound of my heels sliding against the polished wooden floor cut through the absolute pristine quiet of the church like a gunshot. A collective audible gasp rippled instantly across the packed sanctuary. Hundreds of heads swiveled simultaneously in my direction, eyes widening in shock and confusion. In the front row, Valerie whipped around her face, instantly contorting into a mask of pure, vicious, unhinged rage. "Sit down, you absolute embarrassment," my mother hissed violently, her voice a sharp, toxic whisper, meant only for me, her eyes blazing with furious panic. I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her existence. I did not even blink. I kept my gaze locked directly on Preston's absolutely terrified face as I stepped out of the wooden pew and began walking straight down the center aisle toward the altar. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of absolute certainty. The heavy, expectant silence in the sanctuary was deafening, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble floor. Valerie was still hissing behind me, her voice a frantic, venomous sputter, but she did not dare cause a physical altercation in front of the mayor and half the city council. She simply watched in paralyzed horror as I ascended the 3 short steps to the altar. Jasmine was trembling, her veil shaking as she glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Preston looked like he was about to collapse, the color entirely drained from his sweating face. I stopped directly between the bride and the groom, turning my back on my sister to face the hundreds of seated guests. The officiant, a highly respected senior pastor who had mentored my father for decades, lowered his leather-bound book. He looked at me with profound confusion, raising a hand to try and restore order to the suddenly murmuring crowd. "Aaliyah," the pastor said gently, his deep voice echoing through his lapel microphone. "This is highly inappropriate. If you have a grievance, we can resolve it in private." I turned to look at him, my expression completely serene. "I do not object to the marriage, Pastor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the massive vaulted sanctuary, without the need for a microphone. "If my sister wishes to bind herself to this man, she is absolutely free to do so. I object to the felon standing at the altar." A collective gasp ripped through the congregation. The rustling of expensive fabric echoed loudly as hundreds of people shifted forward in their pews, stunned by the sheer audacity of the statement. I turned my attention fully to the senior pastor, keeping my posture relaxed but commanding. "Pastor," I asked, my tone conversational but razor-sharp, "have you been wondering why the $500,000 building fund for the new community center has not cleared the escrow account for Monday's audit?" Down in the front row, DeMarcus leapt to his feet as if he had been struck by lightning. His heavy wooden chair scraped violently backward, tipping over and crashing onto the marble floor. "Security!" my father roared, his voice cracking with sheer, unhinged panic. He pointed a trembling, sweating finger at me, his face flushing a dangerous, blotchy red. "Get her out of here right now. She is having a mental breakdown. Someone remove my daughter from the sanctuary immediately." 2 large men in dark suits started moving rapidly down the side aisles, but I was already holding up my encrypted phone. I did not need to shout over my father. I simply pressed a single button on my screen. I had spent the last 10 minutes in the bridal suite quietly syncing my device directly to the church's state-of-the-art Bluetooth sound system. DeMarcus's frantic shouting was instantly drowned out by the harsh crackling sound of an audio recording blaring from the massive speakers mounted around the room. It was Preston's voice, perfectly clear, undeniably arrogant, and dripping with venomous disdain. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings for every single person in Atlanta to hear. "These people are absolutely pathetic." Preston's recorded voice scoffed, his aristocratic sneer translating perfectly through the audio. "DeMarcus is so desperate to buy his way into our social circle that he literally handed me the access codes to the church's building fund. $500,000, mother. He thought I was transferring it to a high-yield offshore trust to double the church's money." Then came Caroline's voice, her crisp, elitist tone, laced with a wicked, mocking laugh. "It is almost too easy, darling, taking money from a congregation like this. They just blindly trust their shiny, newly rich pastor. And DeMarcus is too terrified of the inevitable audit to say a single word. He actually thinks you are going to pay it back after you marry that delusional daughter of his." "Pay it back." Preston laughed on the recording, a cold, ruthless sound that sent a chill through the sanctuary. "The money is already washed and sitting in your Cayman account. The moment I say I do to Jasmine, we are flying to Switzerland and leaving these fools to deal with the federal fallout." I cut the audio. The sanctuary exploded into pure, unbridled fury. People were shouting and pointing while the elite guests looked around in absolute disgust. Down in the front row, Caroline Blackwell realized the game was entirely over. She dropped her designer clutch, abandoned her aristocratic posture, and began slipping frantically toward the side emergency exit. She kept her head down, trying to use the chaotic shouting crowd as cover to slip into the alleyway. I raised my hand and pointed directly at her retreating figure. "Do not let her leave this building," I commanded, my voice slicing through the uproar with absolute authority. "She is the one holding your church's money in her offshore account." Two massive church deacons immediately stepped in front of the heavy oak doors, crossing their arms and blocking Caroline's path. She slammed into them, shrieking in panic, demanding they move, but they did not budge a single inch. She was trapped. Up on the altar, Preston saw his mother cornered. His survival instinct overrode everything else. He abandoned the facade, abandoned the wealthy groom persona, and spun around, sprinting toward the rear sanctuary doors behind the choir loft. But he did not make it past the first step. Jasmine lunged forward. She grabbed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, her heavy silk veil tearing away from her hair as she yanked him backward with a surprising, frantic strength. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears, her face contorted in absolute, desperate denial. "Preston, where are you going?" Jasmine screamed, shaking him violently. "What is she talking about? Where are our tickets to Switzerland? You promised me we were leaving tonight." Preston looked at the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman he had manipulated and used as a convenient shield. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, raw, vicious cruelty. He gripped Jasmine's wrists, prying her hands off his lapels with brutal force, and shoved her violently backward. Jasmine tripped over her massive silk train, crashing hard onto the marble floor. "There was never a ticket for you, you stupid girl," Preston roared, standing over her. The vicious echo of Preston's words bounced off the vaulted ceiling, silencing the remaining screams of the congregation. Jasmine lay crumpled on the pristine marble floor, her heavy silk veil ripped and tangled around her shoulders. She stared up at the man she had sacrificed her entire family for, her face, a mask of absolute uncomprehending shock. But Preston was no longer looking at her. He was staring in absolute terror at the back of the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors did not just open this time, they burst inward with a violent, deafening crash. More than a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with gold letters across their backs flooded into the center aisle alongside uniformed local police officers. The sheer force of their entry sent an immediate paralyzing shockwave through the packed pews. The string quartet in the balcony completely stopped playing, a final dissonant scrape of a cello bow ringing out before absolute silence fell over the musicians. FBI elite agent bellowed, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Nobody move." The wealthy elite guests from Atlanta and the imported high society aristocrats Caroline had desperately gathered, instantly descended into a frantic, humiliated panic. These were people who guarded their reputations with ruthless precision. The realization that they were currently sitting in the middle of a federal raid, attending a wedding funded by stolen church donations, sent them into a frenzy of self-preservation. Women in designer gowns covered their faces with expensive clutch purses, terrified of being photographed. Men in tailored suits abruptly shifted away from the center aisle, physically distancing themselves from the Thornton family, as if Preston and Caroline were suddenly radioactive. Preston stumbled backward away from the altar, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Two federal agents moved with terrifying speed, vaulting up the 3 short steps. They grabbed Preston by the shoulders of his custom tuxedo, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the polished wooden pulpit. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the murmuring crowd. Preston began sobbing instantly, his shoulders heaving as he babbled incoherent pleas for a lawyer, completely abandoning his arrogant upper-crust persona. Near the side emergency exit, Caroline fared no better. The 2 massive church deacons who had blocked her path simply stepped aside, allowing a female federal agent to take hold of Caroline's arm. Caroline shrieked, twisting and thrashing wildly, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at the air. She demanded that they unhand her, screaming about her social standing, her wealth, and her absolute refusal to be treated like a common criminal. The agent simply twisted Caroline's arm behind her back with practiced clinical efficiency, locking the handcuffs securely around her wrists and pressing her firmly against the stone wall of the sanctuary. Down at the altar, Jasmine was still sprawled on the floor, her custom ivory gown smeared with dust from Preston's shoes. She looked around at the federal agents, the handcuffed groom, and the horrified congregation, and her survival instinct finally kicked into high gear. She immediately resorted to the only tactic she had ever known. She played the helpless, victimized princess. She dragged herself across the marble floor toward the front pew, sobbing hysterically. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands toward our father. DeMarcus stood paralyzed, staring at the absolute destruction of his church and his reputation. "Daddy, please!" Jasmine wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "Daddy, you have to help me. I did not know anything about this. Preston lied to me. He used me. He promised me a beautiful life and he tricked me. Daddy, please protect me. Save me." DeMarcus looked down at his golden child. The daughter he had sacrificed everything for, the daughter he had stolen $500,000 to impress. His face softened with a tragic, desperate need to protect her. He took a slow, trembling step forward, reaching his hands out to pull his precious Jasmine up from the floor. I stepped squarely into his path, physically blocking him from reaching her. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through Jasmine's hysterical sobbing. I held my phone up, my thumb resting perfectly over the screen. "You think she is a victim, Dad. You think your perfect little princess had no idea what was happening to your church. Aaliyah, do not do this." DeMarcus pleaded, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. "She is your sister. She is innocent. Listen to her innocence," I commanded, and I pressed play. The second audio file synced to the massive church speakers, and this time it was Jasmine's voice that filled the sanctuary. Her tone was not sweet or victimized. It was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. "I do not care about the audit." Preston Jasmine's recorded voice sneered, the crisp audio capturing every ounce of her entitlement. "My father is an idiot. If the board finds out the building fund is gone, he will just cry and say the devil attacked his ministry. They will probably just fire him." "And if they press charges?" Preston's voice asked on the recording, a dark amusement coloring his tone. "If your father goes to federal prison for embezzlement, then he goes to prison." Jasmine's voice snapped back, completely devoid of empathy. "He made his choices. I am not letting his stupidity ruin my life. Just make sure the money is fully secured in the Geneva account. The second I have my ring and my title, I am leaving this pathetic city and never looking back. He can rot in a cell for all I care, as long as I get my chateau." I cut the audio. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than anything that had come before it. DeMarcus stood completely frozen. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile, hollow shell. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. His golden child, the daughter he had adored, the daughter he had compromised his entire moral compass and freedom for, had explicitly condemned him to a concrete cell without a second thought. He stumbled backward, his hands flying up to clutch violently at his chest. He gasped for air, his knees buckling as his entire fabricated world collapsed into dust around him. Next to him, Valerie finally understood the true nature of the monster she had raised. The realization shattered her completely. My mother dropped to her knees on the hard floor, throwing her head back and releasing a guttural, agonizing scream of pure, unending despair that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. Jasmine scrambled backward on the floor, her eyes wide with genuine panic, now realizing she had been completely and publicly exposed. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Two federal agents walked slowly down the center aisle, stepping carefully over the imported white roses that had been trampled during the chaos. They approached the altar, looking down at my sister in her ruined designer dress. One agent reached down, hauling Jasmine roughly to her feet by her arm. Jasmine Vance. The agent stated, his voice echoing loudly in the devastated sanctuary, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent sanctuary. Jasmine flinched violently as the cold metal locked around her wrists, pressing tightly against the delicate imported lace of her sleeves. The female federal agent pulled her roughly to her feet, offering absolutely no sympathy for the hysterical sobbing that was now racking my sister's body. Her immaculate $15,000 custom ivory gown was utterly ruined. The heavy silk fabric was smeared with gray dust and black scuff marks from where she had been shoved to the floor. The cathedral-length train, which had trailed behind her so majestically just minutes before, now tangled around her ankles like a heavy, suffocating shroud. "Move," the agent ordered, gripping Jasmine tightly by the bicep and steering her toward the center aisle. The walk back down that long, flower-lined path was a masterclass in absolute humiliation. Jasmine was marched down the exact same aisle she had floated up only moments ago, but her conquering monarch persona had completely evaporated. The elite society guests, the people whose approval she had craved more than oxygen, physically recoiled as she passed. Women in designer dresses pulled their skirts tightly to their legs, stepping back into the pews to avoid letting her ruined train brush against their shoes. The wealthy corporate titans sneered in open disgust, whispering harsh, condemning judgments that carried easily in the quiet room. The working-class members of the congregation, the people whose hard-earned donations she had plotted to steal, stared at her with a cold, righteous fury. Jasmine tried to lift her bound hands to hide her tear-streaked face, her makeup running in dark, messy rivers down her cheeks. She choked on her own sobs, stumbling over her heavy dress, looking absolutely pathetic, as the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swallowed her up and led her out to the waiting federal transport vehicles. With Preston, Caroline, and Jasmine physically removed from the building, the remaining police officers immediately converged on the front of the church. Two detectives stepped squarely in front of DeMarcus. My father looked completely broken. He was sweating profusely, leaning heavily against the wooden railing of the choir loft, clutching his chest as if his heart was physically giving out. DeMarcus Vance, the lead detective, said, his voice flat and professional. "We need to ask you some very serious questions about your authorization of a $500,000 wire transfer from the church escrow account to an offshore holding company belonging to Preston Thornton." DeMarcus opened his mouth, grasping for air, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "I did not know," he stammered, his voice a weak, trembling rasp. "I was trying to secure a better return rate for the building fund. He promised me he was investing it. You have to believe me. I did not steal it for myself." "He did not steal it for himself," I interjected, stepping smoothly into the conversation. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the panic that was suffocating my father. He was simply foolish enough to hand the keys of the kingdom over to a desperate fraudster to buy a social status he could not afford. The detective looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And who exactly are you?" "I am the person who recovered the funds," I replied smoothly. Preston Thornton is an amateur. Tracking a clumsy offshore wire transfer through a series of shell companies is child's play for a competent forensic accounting team. I purchased the debt and filed the necessary injunctions to freeze the Thornton family assets 72 hours ago. The $500,000 was reversed and secured back into the church's primary escrow account this morning. The building fund is completely whole. DeMarcus let out a massive shuddering breath, his knees nearly buckling with relief. He looked at me, a pathetic, desperate gratitude washing over his sweaty face. He truly believed he had just dodged the ultimate bullet. Because the money was fully recovered and secured, the detectives informed him that while he was still the subject of an active, ongoing financial investigation regarding his gross negligence, they would not be placing him in handcuffs today. But the relief on his face lasted for only a fleeting second. The senior pastor, a man my father had idolized, served, and sought validation from for 3 decades, stepped down from the altar. His face was a portrait of profound, unforgiving sorrow mixed with absolute sternness. He stopped directly in front of DeMarcus, looking at my father as if he were a stranger. Pastor DeMarcus breathed, reaching a shaking hand out toward his mentor. The money is safe. The church is whole. It was a mistake, a terrible lapse in judgment, but no harm was done. The harm is spiritual, and it is absolute. The pastor said, his deep, resonant voice carrying through the half-empty sanctuary. You took the savings of hard-working families, widows, and faithful servants, and you risked it all to satisfy your own vanity. You valued the appearance of worldly wealth over the sacred trust of this congregation. You were willing to let this sanctuary crumble just so your daughter could wear a crown she did not earn. DeMarcus shrank backward, shaking his head in frantic, pathetic denial. DeMarcus Vance, the pastor, continued, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. By the power vested in me by the Board of Elders, I am publicly stripping you of your title as deacon. You are hereby removed from all leadership boards, all committees, and all financial oversight. Furthermore, you are officially excommunicated from this congregation. You are no longer welcome in this sanctuary. The words struck DeMarcus harder than any physical blow could have. To a man whose entire identity was built on community perception and social standing, this was a fate worse than a federal prison sentence. He let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, sliding down the polished wood of the pew until he collapsed onto the floor, burying his face in his hands as he wept over the ashes of his ruined reputation. The church was rapidly emptying out the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside, casting frantic, erratic shadows through the massive stained glass windows. Valerie was still on the floor near the front row. She was staring blankly at the empty aisle, her entire universe completely eradicated in the span of 20 minutes. She had lost her European dynasty, her wealthy son-in-law, her foreclosed home, her husband's social standing, and her golden child. Then her manic, tear-filled eyes locked onto me. She looked at my calm posture, my tailored emerald silk, and the absolute terrifying realization of my power finally penetrated her thick skull. She understood in that exact moment that I was not a struggling marketing director. I was a billionaire. I was the person who held the keys to everything. Valerie scrambled up from the floor, stumbling blindly toward me. Her expensive dress was wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearm with tight, digging, frantic fingers. Aaliyah, Valerie sobbed, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed off the stone walls. You are a billionaire. You have the money. You set all of this up, which means you can fix it. Pay her bail. Call your lawyers and get your sister out of that jail cell. Buy our house back from the bank. You have to save us, Aaliyah. We are your family. I stood completely still, letting the silence stretch between us, as her desperate, pathetic begging filled the air. I looked down at her manicured fingers, clutching my silk sleeve, feeling the trembling, frantic heat of her desperation. I thought about the years of neglect, the constant belittling, the endless prioritization of Jasmine, and the absolute total failure of her maternal love. I raised my opposite hand, moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation. I placed my fingers over hers, and with absolute, terrifying calm, I slowly removed my mother's hand from my arm. The physical act of peeling my mother's fingers off my silk sleeve felt like detaching a parasite that had fed on me for decades. I did not shove her away. I simply clamped my hand over her wrist and applied a steady, unyielding pressure until her grip completely failed. Valerie stared up at me from the cold marble floor, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of pure disbelief. She was gasping for breath, completely unable to comprehend that her ultimate authority, her lifelong reign of psychological terror, had just been effortlessly dismantled by the daughter she considered a total failure. I stepped back, smoothing the emerald silk of my dress, creating a physical and emotional chasm between us that would never be crossed again. DeMarcus was still leaning heavily against the wooden railing, his breath rattling in his chest. The sanctuary, once overflowing with manufactured opulence and imported flowers, was now a cavernous, empty tomb. The wealthy guests had long since fled into the Atlanta night. The federal agents had dragged Jasmine and her fraudulent groom out to the waiting transport vans. Only the three of us remained at the front of the church, illuminated by the harsh, sweeping red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashing through the massive stained glass windows. I looked at my broken parents, absorbing the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. There was no pity in my heart. There was no lingering childhood desire to comfort them. There was only the cold, hard, inescapable truth of what they had done. "You want me to save you?" I said, my voice echoing evenly through the empty sanctuary. "You are begging me to fix the absolute disaster you orchestrated. Let us be very clear about what happened here today. You stood in the vestibule of this church and introduced me to your high society friends as a pathetic, unemployed burden. You humiliated me. You tried to erase my success just so you could kiss the feet of a white conman who was actively stealing your home and destroying your community." Valerie opened her mouth to argue, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping her throat, but I cut her off with a sharp look. "You chose your illusion over my reality." I continued, stepping closer to DeMarcus, forcing him to meet my eyes. "You were so desperate for proximity to wealth, so blinded by the fake aristocratic pedigree Preston paraded in front of you, that you handed over the keys to your own kingdom. You sacrificed the hard-earned money of your congregation. You sacrificed your integrity. You even sacrificed me, all to maintain a facade of upper-crust superiority that never actually existed. You worshipped a lie, and now you are choking on the ashes." DeMarcus closed his eyes, fresh tears leaking out from beneath his wrinkled eyelids. "I did not know," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling with a pathetic attempt at justification. "I thought he was a blessing. I thought he was elevating this family. He was elevating his offshore bank accounts, using your colossal vanity as his stepping stone." I replied, my tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "But unlike you, I do not operate on blind faith or desperate social climbing. I operate on data preparation and absolute control." I reached into my small, structured emerald clutch and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. The heavy cream-colored paper felt substantial in my hands. I held it out toward my father. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, his hands shaking violently as he finally reached out and took it from my grasp. "Open it," I commanded. DeMarcus fumbled with the clasp, pulling out a stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy metal clip. His eyes darted across the pages, trying to process the complex financial and legal jargon. I watched the exact moment his brain comprehended the seal at the bottom of the first page. It was the deed to the massive suburban mansion he and Valerie had lorded over me my entire life. "I do not understand," DeMarcus stammered, his eyes wide and terrified as he looked up at me. "How do you have this?" Preston said he was securing a second mortgage to help fund the European transition. Preston forged a predatory loan against your property, using the documents you so willingly signed without reading. I explained, laying out the mechanics of their ruin with clinical precision. He was preparing to let the bank foreclose on you the moment his flight to Switzerland took off. When my legal team froze his assets and initiated the hostile takeover of his shell companies, I proactively bought your debt directly from the bank. I paid it off in full. Valerie let out a sudden, ragged gasp of relief from the floor. "Oh, thank God," she cried out, fresh tears of manufactured gratitude streaming down her face. "Aaliyah, you saved our home. I knew you would not let us lose our house. You are a good daughter." I turned my head, looking down at my mother with a gaze so cold it instantly froze the frantic smile on her face. "I did not save your home, Valerie," I said softly, enunciating every single syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. "I bought it. I hold the deed. I own the property outright. You are currently standing in a church you are excommunicated from, and you are going home to a house that belongs entirely to the daughter you called a failure." DeMarcus dropped the heavy folder. It hit the marble floor with a loud smack, the document spilling out across the polished stone. He looked at me with a profound mounting horror, finally understanding the absolute totality of my victory. "I will grant you 30 days to pack your personal belongings," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "You will vacate the premises by the 1st of next month. I have already contracted an architectural firm to begin renovations. I am tearing out that absurd vanity-driven dining room and converting the entire estate into a high-tech incubator for underprivileged Black youth in the greater Atlanta area. I am turning your monument to greed into a genuine resource for the community you abandoned." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and final. The reality of their eviction, of losing their ultimate status symbol to serve the very people they considered beneath them, broke whatever fragile sanity Valerie had left. She scrambled up from the floor, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged ferocity. "You are a monster!" Valerie screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet church, raw and completely out of control. "You are a wicked, unnatural, vindictive monster. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot do this to your own blood. You are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are dead." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification. Her screaming meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. It was just the hollow noise of a defeated tyrant realizing her reign was over. I simply turned my back on them. I pushed open the oak doors and stepped out into the night air. The flashing police lights painted the street in vibrant colors. I did not look back at the ruins of my family, breathing in the fresh air as a free woman. 6 months passed with the swift, unrelenting efficiency of a perfectly executed algorithm. The sprawling, fraudulent empire the Thornton family had built crumbled into dust, and the justice system showed absolutely no mercy to the architects of the scheme. Caroline and Preston Thornton were swiftly convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The bespoke tuxedos and imported designer gowns were permanently traded in for standard-issue federal prison uniforms. Preston was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a medium-security facility, his aristocratic arrogance completely broken by the harsh, daily reality of his new environment. Caroline was housed in a federal correctional institution for women stripped of her wealth, her social standing, and her stolen vanity. She spent her days mopping cafeteria floors light years away from the high society galas she once ruled. Jasmine did not fare much better. My sister, terrified of spending a decade behind bars, panicked and took a harsh plea deal, turning state's evidence against her own groom the moment the federal investigators offered her a way out. She avoided federal prison, but her European dynasty dreams were entirely dead. She was currently serving 3 years of strict house arrest, confined to a tiny, poorly insulated apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta. A heavy, bulky electronic ankle monitor flashed constantly beneath her sweatpants. To pay off her massive mounting legal fees and court-mandated restitution, the former golden child was now working 50 hours a week at a high-volume customer service call center. Her days of demanding luxury and expecting royal treatment were replaced by endless shifts of answering complaints from angry customers who routinely screamed at her over the phone. DeMarcus and Valerie experienced the most spectacular fall from grace. Exactly 30 days after the disastrous wedding, they packed their remaining personal belongings into rented boxes and vacated the mansion I now owned outright. They moved into a cramped, dark 2-bedroom rental apartment in a neighborhood they once would have actively avoided driving through. DeMarcus had lost his church, his congregation, and his treasured title. Valerie had lost her illusion of superiority. They were completely and totally shunned by the Atlanta elite. The country club socialites and wealthy politicians they had desperately courted actively ignored their phone calls, treating them like social pariahs. They spent their days in bitter, suffocating silence, surrounded by the absolute ruin of their own making. 1,000 miles away from their misery, I was breathing cleaner air. I sat behind a massive, sleek mahogany desk in my expansive corner office in Washington, D.C. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the city skyline, bathing the room in bright, natural morning light. The environment was a testament to authentic, hard-earned success, devoid of any manufactured pretense. Resting on the polished surface of my desk was the latest issue of Forbes magazine. My own face looked back at me from the glossy cover, accompanied by a bold headline naming me as the newest titan of the financial technology sector. The article detailed my company's massive global expansion, our groundbreaking algorithms, and the multi-billion-dollar valuation we had firmly secured. It was a tangible, undeniable validation of every late night, every sacrificed weekend, and every strategic move I had made over the past decade. The heavy glass door to my office swung open quietly. Marcus walked in holding 2 steaming cups of coffee from my favorite local roaster. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that immediately grounded me. Marcus was a brilliant software engineer who had partnered with me back when my company was just a rough concept pitched in a cramped, windowless co-working space. He had loved me when I was sleeping 4 hours a night and eating cheap takeout long before the billion-dollar valuation, long before the Forbes cover, and long before I ever had the power to buy my parents' mansion out from under them. He set a cup down in front of me, leaning over to press a gentle, lingering kiss against my forehead. He glanced down at the magazine cover, his smile widening with genuine, unbridled pride. He did not need to say a single word. The quiet, profound support in his eyes communicated everything I ever needed to hear. He took his seat on the leather sofa across the room, opening his laptop to review our morning briefs, completely comfortable in the empire we had built side by side. I picked up my coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms, and turned my chair to look out over the sprawling city skyline. The towering buildings stretched up toward a perfectly clear, endless blue sky. As I looked out at the horizon, I felt a deep, resonant sense of completion wash over me. The journey had never really been about simple vengeance. Vengeance was a fleeting, temporary satisfaction. What I had achieved was something far more permanent and profound. I had systematically dismantled a toxic, parasitic family dynamic that had tried to suffocate me since childhood. I had shattered the generational trauma of conditional love, exposing the absolute hollowness of valuing appearances over authentic connection. I had refused to remain the scapegoat, refused to be the silent victim, and refused to let their endless greed consume my hard-earned reality. By walking away from their demands and enforcing my ultimate boundaries, I had fiercely protected my own peace. I had reclaimed my narrative from people who only wanted to use me as a stepping stone for their own vanity. I did not just survive their attempts to destroy me. I thrived in the very spaces they told me I did not belong. I built an untouchable empire from the ground up, brick by brick, entirely on my own terms. In this new world, I set the rules. I defined my own value, and I was surrounded only by people who respected the foundation of truth I had laid down. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute freedom that comes with complete independence, knowing I would never have to look back again. Fade to black. True security and self-worth do not come from the approval of a toxic family. They come from recognizing your own value and building a life entirely on your own terms. Sometimes the most empowering choice you can make is to walk away from people who only see you as a stepping stone. By setting firm boundaries, you can break generational trauma and create a beautiful space where you define the rules. If this story of reclaiming power and finding authentic success resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more journeys of resilience and triumph.